Hello friends of YouTube, welcome back to the channel and today's bonus episode for 100 subscribers, where I'll be discussing Cien Años de Soledad, or 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel García Márquez, which of course is a famous work of fiction from Colombia and worldwide. And on this fine rainy afternoon, I'm going to discuss it as well as a number of themes that it kind of brought up in my mind and as I was reading it. But first, cheers. Thank you all for following and commenting on the videos. Those of you who do, liking, whatever you do to contribute to this channel, and give me a little bit more motivation to keep going. Okay, so I think I finally got my camera stabilized. This video is probably going to be a longer one. There's a lot to talk about with this magnificent work, 100 Years of Solitude. Let's start with the idea of solitude. It's perfect for 100 subscribers because I think as readers, if maybe we're not all introverts, I would hazard to say we're probably mostly introverts, and at the very least, if we aren't, we all have a certain relationship with solitude that not everyone does. And I'm not saying you have to be a reader to appreciate solitude and being with your thoughts. All I'm saying is that as a reader, you are certainly somebody who knows how to be with your own thoughts. And this often goes hand in hand with creative minds as well, I think. Now, in the beginning of the book, we have Jose Arcadio Buendia and his wife Ursula. They found a house in this fictional town of Macondo in Colombia. And this town is based on a real place that Gabriel García Márquez grew up, from what I understand. I haven't gone way into Gabriel García Márquez's past and what inspired this book, but I've certainly picked up some things as I've been reading this and listening to some different things. But when they found this town and they build their house, Jose Arcadio Buendia, to me, as he becomes involved with these gypsies that come in, Melquiades is the main one, and starts to get into alchemy and kind of the at that time modern technology that they're bringing in, like a giant lens or magnifying glass or something like that. As all this stuff is happening, I kind of see Jose Arcadio Buendia as a mad scientist type of character. And this, to me, is representative. Even though it's a little bit, he is definitely like a mad scientist, but he's also brilliant. He understands that the world is round, which is already well known in many areas of the world at this time. But then Melquiades recognizes that, you know, he had to reason that. He didn't read that anywhere. So you have this description of Macondo in being almost like a prehistoric area. You know, the stones are described as prehistoric looking, and like just this, there's this sense of like timelessness and ancientness to the place that they're in. And Jose Arcadio Buendia, not only could he represent the germ of humanity in the beginning of this book, but also the germ of the creator and the creative spirit. So this kind of leads me to what this book is really about. And I guess the broadest way I can say it is a family that is in a kind of downward spiral uh, due to a number of reasons, character flaws, which often are also their strengths and what makes them who they are. You have kind of sometimes mental illness and sometimes incest is something that's a big part of this book, which is in a lot of Latin American literature for some reason. It does seem to come up, and there is kind of an explanation that the circles of power in Latin American, South American countries have actually practiced, marrying cousins and such, and just like the royalty of Europe, and that was brought from kind of the medieval thinking of Europe, from what I understand. But it's a way of kind of maintaining this circle of power and this kind of isolation. But the roots of this isolation, what are they? Fear of the outside? Are they, in these strange lands, so alienated from where they're actually from? I don't know. That's a whole other topic that I probably don't really know what I'm talking about if I get into that, but that's just kind of what came into my head. So I was talking about this downward spiral of a family, and I promise I'm going to connect this right now to what I was just talking about, how Jose Arcadio Buendia, in beginning this family, much like Gabriel Garcia Marquez had been, thinking about this novel in his head for so long and finally stepped to put it down. I can imagine he putting himself in seeing Jose Arcadio Buendia as the germ of this whole idea, the germ of the seed that was going to just spread its tendrils and grow this family. But it actually the book to me represents not only the downward spiral of this family, but the downward spiral of a person's of like ideas, of thought. So that could be on an individual level or on a society level, where ideas, when they become too closed in and sort of too incestual, as it were, start to kind of just spiral in on themselves, and over time become less and less potent and more what's the word? An aberration, an aberration rather than uh, a helpful personality trait or a helpful idea. And these aberrations, though, are just as powerful and take their own course. There's so much more to the book, but this is kind of just the first. If I have to sum up what I found in it and what I got out of it, that's how I read it. Also, I was just I did become attached to this family, to the characters. Coronel Aureliano Buendia, who the book opens with saying he's standing in front of a firing squad, and would remember years later when his father, when he was standing in front of the firing squad, when his father took him to see ice. Now, the gypsies bring ice in a box, and it's preserved ice. So they're like, oh, this is incredible technology to them, being in this tropical area. And Jose Arcadio Buendia imagines Macondo being someday a city completely of ice. Does this mean like a city of glass, like he's imagining a futuristic Macondo, being a visionary? I don't know. That was kind of what I thought in that moment. But without getting into spoilers, I can't really say much more on that. So this is tough. To talk about this book, because there's so much in it, and it's like 460 pages, and yet I was very surprised how little of that time I was ever like feeling like space was wasted. I mean, the book doesn't waste your time despite it being so long and covering so much ground, 100 years to be exact. um, You know, it's so to wrap up what I was saying. Um, this downward spiral of ideas or people or society or a family or an individual, um, due to kind of the this being shut in and the aberrations, our ideas turn in and our spirits kind of turning into aberrations of themselves. This very early in the book there is a disease of insomnia. And the terrible thing about this insomnia is not the lack of sleep, but forgetting, and forgetting the past and not learning from the past. And that's very much tied to this idea. But it also celebrates the struggles, and I can attest to this becoming attached to the characters, or Remedios the Beautiful, for example, or the first Remedios, who is so innocent, and it's kind of horrible. The path that she is forced to take. Um, you'll get there, but becoming attached to these characters, it celebrates the struggles in between, and the book also celebrates life. It's quite an achievement. Um, the the writing. So of course I read it in Spanish. Um, but I also listened to it in English while working, in the same approach that I took to Pedro Paramo. Um, and whenever I can, I try to take that approach so that I can at least get an idea of how it translates to English. Sometimes it's not possible. There are definitely some things missed if you read it in English, or things that they don't come across the same. And I was actually quite stunned that so when I read it in Spanish, it all made sense. It wasn't like Pedro Paramo, or it was like, wow, I got to read this multiple times. That book was a big influence on this one, by the way. Check out that video as a precursor to this one. But the writing here is in a way that in Spanish, different things get emphasized. The tense of the book is hard to pin down. I'm sure like somebody who's well versed in English terms and or Spanish grammar or whatever could say exactly what it is, but it's like it's talking from a perspective of like in the present. It's narrating in the present, but talking about characters who in the future will remember things in the past, and this tonal. I'm never really quite sure if the narrator is talking from the future or the present, or where it's coming from, which is a really strange sensation, but the tone is so consistent in this book. Um, and when you read it in Spanish versus when I listen to it in English, certain details just I completely missed in English. And then other details I completely missed. I just didn't even pay attention to when I was reading it in Spanish. The reading of Spanish was much more rewarding and much more joyful, and just felt much more connected to it because it's the original language. And I'm going to talk in a second about reading bilingual as well. The this tone of the novel and the way that everything is kind of mixed, but it's still, you still can follow the story quite easily. A lot of things kind of are told out of order, and sometimes you don't exactly make sense of a situation until you read a little bit further. But it's what am I trying to say here? This is so hard to talk about. The Yeah, it was like I read, in a way, two different books, reading it in Spanish and listening to it in English. I just certain details were much more noticeable in one way of experiencing the story versus the other. And that has to be a mark of a great work, because again, it's just that kaleidoscoping thing. You see something from multiple angles every time you experience it, and when you experience it in a different way, in a translation versus the original, or just multiple times, and depending on your mood, depending where you are. So that does tend to be a mark of a great work, and I really look forward to rereading this and seeing what details stand out to me in the future as well. Um, but this difference I'm starting to notice in reading many of these books in Spanish versus English. It's funny because a friend of mine said, "You always got to flex that you can read Spanish." Well, of course I do. Of course I do. But the thing I want to talk about here is that, for one, I feel makes me qualified to do this kind of project because it's that's like, 20 extra countries that I can actually read these books in the original language they were written. Like, that's a significant portion of countries. Just to have only English and Spanish, like that really opens up a lot. But second, reading in Spanish, I enjoy and am enjoying in some ways more than reading in English. And I don't know if it's because I find it to be a more beautiful language. I so far have found the books that I've been reading in Spanish to just flow in my mind more beautifully. The language, I sink it in more. But I think a big part of this is that reading in Spanish forces me to slow down. When I read in English, I mean, I read fast. Like, sometimes, like, and this does not affect my comprehension. I just do tend to read fast. And really, if I want to go slow in English, the author has to write in a way that makes me slow down. And there's certain books that have done that and can do that. And sometimes translations make me do that if depending on the language that they're coming from, and I can't just kind of skim. But there are a lot of books in English that, there's parts that I'll just start skimming over. I can't do that in Spanish, and I can't allow myself to do it, or I won't understand it. And I am when I read these books, I'm very critical with myself about, okay, if you just skim that section, you're going to pretend like you read it. No, you got to actually read it and understand it. So reading books in Spanish is more work for me, and I have to read slower, but I also get more joy and feel more rewarded from doing it. And I think that might be it, or I might just enjoy literature in Spanish more, and reading in Spanish, and the sound of the language itself in my head. Um, the good writers of Spanish make it sound pretty, but I've read works in Spanish that don't sound that great either, or don't have the kind of rhythm like Cien Años de Soledad. This book has an incredible rhythm to the writing. I don't know how much more I can say than that, but the language of it is varied and yet totally consistent, as I mentioned. Gabriel Garcia Marquez's voice is so distinct, and having already read a book of his for this project, in some ways I feel like that was a totally different author if it weren't for the voice. Like, the style of the way the book was written, completely different, but the voice, definitely you can tell it's the same author. And in that voice of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and I think this carries to English. I do think on some level, in Spanish you really feel it, but but even reading his works in English, you can feel the voice of Gabriel Garcia Marquez come through in the English, and that is so cool. There's this rhythm to it that the translator, he must have good translators, because from the little I've heard, it does carry. And it actually makes me wonder, now that I'm reading other translations from languages I don't know into English, I'm always thinking about that, like how much of the original writing and the rhythm is carrying over. And it's nice sometimes when I can just go and look up maybe an audiobook or a passage that's being read from whatever book I'm reading in the original language, even if I don't understand it, just to kind of get the sense of what that rhythm is and if it's actually being communicated. Um, so the voice of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, so distinct, and and I can hear parts of his two major influences. Pedro Paramo, I feel like was more an influence of content on 100 Years of Solitude. I feel like Juan Rulfo's voice in that book is completely distinct. I find Gabriel Garcia Marquez's rhythm and writing closer to Alejo Carpentier, who I read Explosion in a Cathedral, or in Spanish, El Siglo de las Luces. His writing, Alejo Carpentier's writing, I described as just incredibly gorgeous, some of the most beautiful I'd ever read. Just the rhythm and the vocabulary. And Alejo Carpentier still is just the king of Spanish vocabulary as far as I'm concerned. But Gabriel Garcia Marquez certainly takes some of the rhythm from Alejo Carpentier. At least that's what I felt. There was some connection there, although I can't, not quite smart enough or haven't looked into it enough to say exactly what it is, but that's what I felt. And I've read so many authors, I feel, who've tried to imitate both Gabriel Garcia Marquez's voice or his style, and none of them do it as well as he does. And I don't know if it's intentional or not intentional, but there's a reason that this is becoming a canonical work of literature, because the impact of Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, is absolutely massive. The authors around the world, especially doing this project, I'm finding how many of the authors I'm reading and searching are inspired by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, how many readers around the world are finding him. This book is on the level, and will become, I believe, on the level of your Don Quixotes and your your Dostoevsky, the great works of literature of the world, because it has influenced so many people, and the themes of the book are universal, while also showing something about Latin America. But it shows things from perspectives, and it uses this idea of magical realism, which I'm going to talk about as the last kind of major theme in this video, in a way that shows perspectives and shows and reveals life experiences and feelings that cannot be communicated through your typical realism, I suppose. That's one interpretation, but I do want to talk more about that, because I am not convinced that I like the term of magical realism. I'm still open to it. I'm still open to using it, but I'm becoming more convinced that it's not great. Though I do think that Gabriel Garcia Marquez did something different with 100 Years of Solitude that hadn't really been done before in this way, and that's why it's an important work of literature. But I don't know if magical realism is how I like communicates what it is. One thing I do want to say is, with all these imitators, the especially pale imitations of 100 Years of Solitude are done in English. And I'm actually worried that reading it might actually ruin a lot of other literature for me, because I'm going to realize like how derivative a lot of it is. And I was already thinking about that as I was reading it. And yet when you read it, it doesn't feel derivative. It feels fresh, and it's done so well. And it really just comes from the heart, and not any sort of conceptual trying to do a certain thing or trying to achieve a certain style. It's I connected with it on that gut heart level. So that's why it really makes it apparent when other authors are trying to emulate it. And that's not to say it's because their writing isn't coming from the heart, but truly great writing is hard to do. And Gabriel Garcia Marquez, when he wrote this, had, of course, already been a writer for many years. He studied, he read widely, and it's not anyone who can be an author. It really is like a gift, and something that you can't really set out to write a great work of canonical literature. This is just kind of you express what you have to express, and it's okay if it's not. But that's just the magic of what 100 Years of Solitude is, or a work of literature like that. And I'm just rambling again, but um, yeah, he pulls off he pulls off incredibly difficult scenes in this book, like the kind of scenes that he writes in and scenarios that he writes about, and the stories he creates in this Buendia family, in the hands of a lesser writer, would just be god awful to read. Uh, that's one thing that I was just astounded with through the whole book. Like when I'm like, oh no, he's really going there. How's he gonna pull this off? And then he pulls it off. That's what I find so amazing about it. Um, and finally, to get into the magical realism thing and why it doesn't sit so well with me, is I felt a sense in reading 100 Years of Solitude. There were more than one times, and I've thought this too about Pedro Paramo, and I've thought it about other works that are described as potentially magic realism, that they capture psychological horror better than horror novels that I've read. Just about any. Like the stuff that people call magical realism often has tones like very disturbing, like mentally disturbing things, and I don't mean and nothing to do with shock value. Um, because a lot of times they create questionable sanities, where characters have questionable sanities because magical things are happening, but you're not quite sure. There's many parts in this book where you're questioning the sanity of multiple characters, and this is very different from an unreliable narrator. Um, in the case of Pedro Paramo, I guess you could say there was an unreliable narrator. But in the way, in my opinion, all narrators are unreliable to a certain extent. Whether because the author is creating a character, ideally, unless the narrator is supposed to specifically be the author, then the narrator is still then the narrator is still unreliable because it's the author, and you can question what the author is thinking and their sanity on some level. So the two ideas that I can't really understand what makes them different from your typical book: unreliable narrator and magical realism, are two ideas that, like, I feel like really most books have. A realist novel to me is more uncommon than a magical realist novel. I mean, look at like the classics, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, I always go back to, or say like Beowulf, like the epics of the past, or even like Arabian Nights. All of this has elements of magic based in real, or what the people who told these stories thought to be real scenarios. So magical realism to me is as old as literature itself, and in many ways most of the most famous literature out there is in some way magical realism. Maybe I'm understanding this wrong, and maybe I'm just an uncultured idiot for saying this stuff, but I don't think I am. I don't think I am, because I've read, there's a lot of people who've read a lot more than me, but I've certainly read a lot of books, and this is kind of the sense I'm getting. So I don't necessarily like to judge books on or separate them into those kinds of categories. It's kind of interesting, or maybe it's just what I gravitate to, but it seems to me that even a realist novel, doesn't tell things in a way that is true, if that makes sense. In real life, there is no narrator that is, saying, okay, Mike is going to talk and do this video today, and his wife is sitting in the other room, and there are, 5 people who are going to appreciate his video, and then eliminating all the other like nonsense that's going out there. I mean, there's like 100 lives out there that are going on. That is there no narrator for them, or is there some supreme ultra narrator? Wow, this conversation really went off the rails, didn't it? My point is is that realism does not capture reality in any real way either. It's still just like history or any kind of storytelling, eliminating down to a few details and telling a story in a way. So somebody define magical realism or an unreliable narrator to me in a way that makes sense. Maybe this kind of thinking is just very postmodern and very I don't know. I'm just trying to talk my thoughts out here, guys. Don't take anything too seriously, but it's just a conversation I'm trying to engage in, and this book really got me thinking too about just you know the the beauty of the beauty of like this flawed life. The Buendia family is very, very flawed, and they witness everything that's going on around them. Um, but trying to find like the joy of life in something that is so inherently flawed is something that South American and Latin American literature in general brings to the surface that I don't feel it. I don't feel it so much from any other literature, and maybe it's because I'm reading it in the original language that it was written in, Spanish being a beautiful original language, tonally and written, that I feel that way, and having some connection to South America myself, having lived in Peru for a few years. I just and I visited Colombia, by the way. I've been to Bogota and Cartagena on a just a vacation, as well as Brazil. So that and previously Ecuador as well. So that's about the extent of my travels outside of the United States. All pretty much all of it being in South America. So South America is just a special region to me, and I'm so happy that I could celebrate 100 subscribers with this book, 100 years of solitude, or Cien años de soledad, because it's a book I've wanted to read for so long and have been needlessly intimidated by, and one that I am so sure is representative of the region in the canonical world literature. So not the only one, but certainly one of them. So I am just I also want to say, as kind of an added note, because I'm bringing video games slowly into this. Of there's a video game out there called What Remains of Edith Finch that I learned was mainly inspired by 100 Years of Solitude, and it takes the ideas of 100 Years of Solitude, like a family, kind of this family tree over the course of 100 years, and the family seems just kind of cursed. Like there's all these mental problems and just bad luck that happens to them, but also like magnificent and glorious things. It's and they all kind of come to bad ends. By the way that um the last one, the last death of this book, I find to be like actually wow. Did not expect it. And I can't say it. It's a spoiler, but someday I'll do a better analysis on this book and talk about it. But it goes back to like that horror, the that this book does horror better than most horror that I've read, and I'm surprised at the level of psychological horror that's in this book. Um, and the ending, again, I guess this is a spoiler, but I'm not going to be specific. The ending is kind of this infinite loop where you, as the reader, are looking at a mirror of something that you are doing, and it could be the very book that you're reading that's mentioned in the end. And it's like, it's one of those crazy endings that just messes with your head. uh it's so good. um yeah, so What Remains of Edith Finch video game, I played through it in about 3 hours, and it was so cool. It was, yeah, take 100 Years of Solitude, bring it to the United States, and maybe like a century later, so it goes up to like the modern day, but you're exploring the house of this family and seeing like how they are all kind of cursed in their own way. And yeah, I hope again someday I can do an analysis of this book and talk about some of the media that is it is inspired. This Edith Finch being one of them. I know there's been movies, other books inspired by 100 Years of Solitude. The influence is way more widespread than I probably even know, and I've already heard it mentioned and referenced in so many things. So I think that should do it for today's video. I've talked a lot. This is a, again, 100 subscriber special, so I wanted to make it special and really let go and talk about a lot of stuff. I don't know if this will be interesting to anybody, but here it is. And I'm going to go back to, shorter videos covering the next books, I hope. I mean, I talk for as long as I feel I need to, which is sometimes longer than I should, but it's always only what I feel I need to. I don't extend it artificially. But the next books I'm hoping are going to be a bit more to the point in the video. So look forward to those. I have no plans to slow down. Going to at least try to keep up one book a week. I appreciate so much anyone who's following this journey, commenting, subscribing. Truly appreciate it. That anyone would want to listen to me talk about these books. And so happy to hear that I am bringing books to people's attention that they hadn't otherwise heard of. Just really awesome comments, my friends. Please keep it up if you do watch and enjoy the videos. So, and I certainly don't expect anybody to watch every video or keep it up. This is really mainly, first and foremost, kind of a diary, vlog entries for me as I'm going on this journey. Hence the rambling and lack of editing, so that I can really keep the focus on just reading and experiencing as much as I can. And then in the future, we'll see what direction to go. I really do want to keep up like book analysis and synthesize a lot of this reading into future projects. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see where we go from here. I'm thinking this is probably the longest video I've done. So without further ado, please have a great day, night, wherever you are, and thank you again